Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Alibaba Cloud Security. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's speaker is Tim Coakley, Senior Security Solutions Architect. During the webcast, you have any questions for Tim, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Tim.
Thank you, Carol. My name is Tim Coakley, and I will be talking about Alibaba Cloud Security. I'd just like to thank everyone for attending this morning, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. This talk is aimed at a broad audience. It's not too technical. So essentially anybody in security function, as well as anyone in administrative or operational type roles using AliCloud will benefit. There's a lot of work that goes on in the background to provide these webcasts for the security community. So I would just like to thank SANS and the webcast team at SANS for helping to manage, organise and help presenters such as myself for these upcoming webcasts. It's a fantastic resource. So about my professional background, it's about me. So before we get into the detail, I currently work for a large multinational company within the security architecture team as a senior security solutions architect. In this role, I help to contribute to secure the business security structures. This includes the solutions and the cloud environments that the business chooses to adopt. Prior to this, I've held engineering and InfoSec roles, conducting security reviews and penetration testing engagements. I also have past background within digital forensics. I did this for around a decade, working on all manner of digital evidence supporting criminal investigations. I've also worked within software development, both research and developing software, and working as an independent business owner. And I also spend some time researching and improving my knowledge within the wider cybersecurity space, with the occasional certification as well. So where did this webcast come from? So I currently work within a multinational company, and we've adopted a multi-cloud strategy. So this includes AWS, Microsoft Azure, GCP and AliCloud environments. And in that respect, I'm really fortunate as it provides a broad exposure to the different cloud vendors, and it also the security challenges that brings as well. But prior to this current role, I had experienced multi-cloud in previous organizations, and my experiences have differed significantly. So in one particular organization, AliCloud was present. It was in use by a third party, but there wasn't any security oversight. Not only that, but the willingness to review even at the basic level was not there. And I think this was just down to lack of resource, training, experience. But whatever the reason was, it presented a risk that wasn't recorded or dealt with. In a more recent organization I worked, the organization had its own AliCloud account, and it had solutions deployed, yet again, there was no security oversight. There was no information who was overall responsible for those accounts, and that presented an even greater risk than the previous example. And I think the reason for this lack of oversight was simply due to prioritization of one cloud provider over another. And looking back, this has still been a little surprising for me because AliCloud has been in existence for over a decade, which is fairly long in tech terms. And now I think greater awareness and focus needs to be made on this cloud provider. But as with anything cloud related, it's really difficult to condense so much detail into one talk, but at least hope to cover some key areas that I think will leave you with more questions and more areas to explore. But at the very least, I would like to increase awareness of AliCloud to the security community, I'd like to dig a little bit more into the security service offerings that AliCloud provide and look into some of the areas that security professionals should be aware of, including some of the threats as well. So security is a team sport. We can't work alone. And during this webcast or afterwards, I'm very interested to hear from attendees about their experiences with AliCloud. I think this is really important. Your view as maybe as an administrator or a software developer, and not necessarily a full-time security role. And with that comes a different perspective, different ways of working that can enrich the knowledge of others, myself included, and just help improve our collective experience. So as I mentioned, I work in a multinational company, but I'm based in Western Europe. So I have a Western perspective. I'm not based, for example, in China as an administrator where experiences, perceptions, usage levels may differ. So please reach out to me. My LinkedIn is available there for professional connections. So about AliCloud, so the provider has a number of names. You'll hear Alibaba Cloud, AliUn, or AliCloud. I personally find it easier to say AliCloud, so I'll use that throughout the talk. So AliCloud is an infrastructure as a service, cloud service provider, which means you can build and host your own network environments. You could have your entire business built and maintained within an account with minimal need for any on-premise equipment. It's over 10 years old, so it's fairly mature in tech terms, and it offers global services, meaning it's not just based in China. AliCloud is not going away. In fact, as with other cloud providers, it's expanding at a very healthy rate. And as indicated in my introduction, at least in my experience, AliCloud is often overlooked as a provider in a security context. It's common that you'll hear the term Big Three, meaning AWS, Azure, and GCP. And many of the roles that are advertised within cloud security will often list one or all of those Big Three in job descriptions with no mention of AliCloud. And I think this is very much due to the commercial dominance, certainly in Western parts of the world over the previous years, which I think plays a factor. But the subject of cloud itself as well can be really overwhelming and complex. And it's just simply not possible to learn and understand everything with one cloud provider. You've got the pace of change, and development alone makes it difficult. And I've spoken to technical account managers who work for cloud service providers, and they themselves are finding it difficult. So when you factor in an organization that has, for example, AWS and Azure, it's not surprising that there's little resource left over for those use cases involving AliCloud. But I guess before committing any resource, particularly where security resources are often limited, it's important to ask the basic questions first. If you couldn't answer these questions, then that's a separate challenge. But the first question is your organization using AliCloud? And this may vary. I've worked in environments that have met each of the following responses. In my experience, when the response was, we do not know, at the time this was due to the size of the organization that I worked, the lack of an inventory of assets, meaning getting a quick and accurate answer was just not achievable. We could have had multiple AliCloud accounts, but the answer was just not readily available. So no further action was performed due to other competing priorities. The second response I've experienced is, we know and we do something. So the organization where I currently work, we have AliCloud accounts that are managed. We have security oversight and some governance in place. So it's always improving, and that's part of an ongoing maturity process. And the third response I've had experience of is we know and do nothing. And this has been the most surprising and most memorable for me, because the organization I worked at the time, I guess, was suffering from paralysis. It was dealing with politics, the size, the complexity of its most used provider at the time, which was AWS. And this paralysis led to little security oversight of the lesser utilized Azure, and zero security oversight of AliCloud environments. And I believe that persists to this day with that particular organization. And then the last question is around third parties. So if you're fortunate enough to have third-party security assurance functions, this can really help. But if you purchase a solution that's hosted by a vendor, and that vendor is using AliCloud, are you vetting these, and how are you going about it? How would you know what good looks like? So there's some useful questions there. And then finally, we as security professionals, we don't usually get the decision which cloud service providers the business uses. Most businesses are about making profit, about being competitive. So it's not impossible for an enterprise to be 99% AWS and have a small 1% AliCloud presence, because that 1% is needed for some specific business reasons. And this means that security must have a baseline level of knowledge of different cloud service providers to tackle this kind of situation and any variations as the business naturally expands or contracts. So AliCloud use cases, businesses will, I guess, naturally grow, organically grow. It's never the perfect ecosystem. It's rarely ordered, it's rarely neat and tidy. And you tend to have a mix of both old and new technology. And with this in mind, there are many use cases why a CSP would be introduced into a business. Usually it's just an innocent reason and just to get business done. And these are some of the experiences I've had. So the first one was as simple as an employee with a credit card. I'm not sure how common this is, but there was a manager who used his credit card to purchase a cloud account. In other words, it wasn't part of any formal procurement process. And then several years later, it became a dependency. The original administrators with the ad hoc deployments and configurations had since moved on. Then the second reason could be regulation. So that might dictate hosting. And you have a cloud account that's specific to a particular country's laws. China is a good example. So you use a cloud service provider hosted in that country. That may make business simply easier to achieve. You've also got global enterprises in a similar vein to regulation, hosting solutions and services close to more favorable business operations, leads to cloud environments that are going to be distributed across major cities around the world. You also have APAC presence. So APAC is Asia Pacific. And it makes perfect business sense to have cloud accounts hosted in Asian markets, again, closer to business operations. You also have third parties that I mentioned previously, where services and solutions are procured by the business. They may be hosted in AliCloud, and by extension, business records and personal data may be hosted in accounts that are not directly hosted by your business, but instead by the vendor. And then finally, you've got what I call shadow CSP, and that could be a single cloud account hosting a single solution, developed and funded by a business unit, maintained by one or two members of staff to fulfill some sort of business dependency. And in all of these use cases, security do really need to know about them. Otherwise, it becomes an unmanaged risk and a potential route to compromise. We've also got the cloud growth and demand. I'm a little bit skeptical with statistics, because it is possible to find statistics to prove what you want. But here we've got Gartner from 2020. I wouldn't get too hung up and focus too much on the overall position of each cloud vendor. So who is number 1, 2, or 3? I don't think that's really important. But what is important in my view is the demand across all providers. Each provider is showing strong levels of growth, and that means we haven't reached the peak of demand yet, and we've got no immediate signs of growth slowing either. It also shows as well that there's room for competition, meaning that we are going to have multi-cloud for the foreseeable future. It also shows as well that we can't focus just on a single cloud provider strategy either. But another factor to consider is the user base. And I'm not talking about the customers that purchase cloud services, but the end users as well that the solutions hosted on the cloud. So popularity of AliCloud is currently greater in Asian markets. And this is particularly true of large populous countries. So we have China, we have Indonesia, Philippines, India. So if you consider if we had a single solution and that solution is hosted within a single AliCloud account, that could potentially be providing services to tens of millions of users and beyond. And do we as security professionals usually get that type of visibility of user base? Personally, I don't. I'm more likely to deal with backlog of security tasks in order of severity or criticality. Also, as well, these populous countries will each have successful businesses as well. So therefore, those companies are going to be targeted by cloud providers like AliCloud to expand and build presence further abroad. So I think there's a real danger here when enterprises, when they don't allocate at least some resource to security governance in AliCloud, it's really a gamble on the part of the business, hoping nothing negative is going to happen. So compared to several years ago, today there's many resources to better understand and categorize threats that can impact cloud. Cloud Security Alliance, as an example resource, that provides a wealth of information and detail, and these are well documented. But there are other aspects as well, I guess, that magnify these threats, namely limited security staff and multi-cloud environments. So as an example, if you have one person providing security coverage to multiple cloud environments, it's really difficult to protect an enterprise with such limited personnel. And this is where any CSP outside of the big three are going to be missed as well. We've also got preferential allocation of resource in some organizations, and this is where AliCloud may never be monitored for security, not now or even in the next few years, which presents a great opportunity to threat actors looking for their next target. We also hear a lot about insider threat, and which is one of those threats that's more prominent in my mind. It may not be the most common, but maybe just my previous backgrounds and bias. But in any case, it's, how are we dealing with employees that have gone rogue or made a mistake accidentally? How would we know an employee doing bad things to cloud environments? An even more difficult challenge to consider are insider threats from within the cloud service providers themselves, something that any CSP isn't immune from either. So in my previous career, I was doing digital forensics, and I came to the conclusion that anybody is capable of anything. It hasn't stopped me from being surprised, but that belief over time has been reinforced. And the story here on the right is a recent article that I read. And again, it surprised me because you have an IT director, a very good job for a reputable company, decides to abuse and steal the privilege and steal laptops, remove the tracking software and sell them on eBay. And it's a very short-term opportunistic type of crime. There's going to be a trail of activity, and that person's not going to expect to do it indefinitely. And we're not also talking huge sums of money. So this is a really good example of insider threat. It's not cloud specific, but the motivation that drives people to do things could seriously harm an organization. So as a security conscious person, have a think about how you could monetize unmonitored cloud accounts such as AliCloud. Do you think you could get away with your crime for longer than a year? Do you think you could anonymize your behavior? If the organization you're working for is not allocating any resource to monitor security within its entire cloud environment, then the answers to those questions are going to be a little easier. And then finally, we've got political threats as well. So most people read the news and current affairs, and they'll be aware to some degree political disputes between, say, US and China, etc. So I'm not a politician, and that's slightly out of the scope of security, more for politicians and diplomats to navigate. But your organization would need to consider legal and data privacy ramifications in that situation. Okay, so I mentioned insider threat, but what about other threats? And there are many. We're usually short on resource, but we've always got plenty of threats. My worry and focus is really on reducing the risk of compromise and trying to limit and prevent initial compromise. I've completed numerous security reviews and pen test exercises, and there are 5 areas that repeat in most reports. You'll see these documented on the internet in various forms and presentations. I personally use this mnemonic on the bottom just to help me keep focus. There's just so much in security to do, and it's a little overwhelming. There's so much to learn, and I often get sidetracked, and that's an easy way to make a mistake and miss something. So I use this as a reference, just as a guide for me. So I do memorize "we intentionally undercook spicy sausage" to remind myself of these 5 points. It's unique for me as it's something I wouldn't normally say in a conversation, and I'd recommend you doing something similar as well. And it describes the 5 things there. So weak or leaked passwords, insider threat, unpatched vulnerabilities, security misconfigurations, and social engineering. And there's quite a lot packed into those threats, but I really do find it encompasses some of those key threats for cloud, as with any solution as well, that I use all the time. So social engineering as an example, I don't know if you've ever seen those job descriptions on the internet that ask for skills beyond a person's ability with multiple roles all merged into one, and it usually adds up to about 100 years experience. So what would happen if you sent a CV matching everything asked for by a recruiter? So recruiters will very rarely check all the details in a CV, and given the current pandemic, remote interview is also standard practice. You've got demand for cloud security professionals being very high at the moment, so the chances of an interview based on a good CV is also high. And this provides a perfect opportunity to gather information on an organization, the number of security staff, future and short-term plans, and also what they're not doing, not looking at. So this technique could negatively impact organizations that have ungoverned cloud accounts because cloud itself is still in that rapid growth stage. So in this example, so some recommendations on this would be more internal security awareness for human resource hiring staff, especially on those too good to be true CVs, and maybe some basic checks where possible. But I think it's just equally important as well, it'd be also need some internal security awareness for the interviewers too, and maybe some agreed areas not to divulge in an interview. I once attended an interview several years back for a bank, and the interview panel would never confirm any tools used. The reply I got was, "We used industry standard tools." And that was a good example of limited information in an interview. So that's one example of social engineering. Slightly deviating from threats, we've got open source intelligence, so OSINT, as you often hear. That's collection, analysis, and making decisions based on public data sources. So the following example is a scenario that I think should be taken seriously, especially if you're trying to get additional security resource to support any AliCloud environments in your business. So this is more for opportunistic attackers looking for weaker targets. So enterprises that choose to focus on the big three and overlook other cloud providers such as AliCloud might be at higher risk. So in this screen here, if you've not heard of Shodan before, Shodan is an online searchable database of devices and servers. And it can be used to discover webcams, Internet of Things, service banners. And in this example, I've used it to discover web services hosted on AliCloud, AWS, and Azure. And it's shown us 3 separate reports there. And this was a search I did in November 2020. But it's important to note that the figures are likely to be lower. There's just other technical factors such as web services that are advertised on IPv4. But you've also got web services that are not listed here that may be advertised on IPv6. So by itself, this provides a list of potential web servers. It's not so much of a risk, but as a threat actor, she could analyze all of these results, identify the genuine web servers hosting business content, and then identify the organization or business owner that maintains those servers. The threat actor could then search for various job internet sites for business names, looking for advertised cloud or security roles. And the job roles are interesting because they provide threat actors with valuable info, such as business priorities and key technologies being used. So using this combined information, the attacker can develop their own intelligence. So in summary, if a threat actor discovers a business website hosted on AliCloud, but recent job adverts by the business for cloud operations or cloud security engineers only list requirements for AWS and Azure, and there's no mention of AliCloud, what would that tell a potential attacker? Well, it could provide a really strong indication that internet-facing resources owned by a business are not being monitored. So there you've got what's not a priority for a business then becomes the priority for the attacker. And that's an example of open source intelligence. So AliCloud itself, the first thing you might encounter that's different is AliCloud provides 2 different types of account. International for CSP customers outside of China, and then mainland China for CSP customers within China. So why the difference? Well, this is probably really due to the complicated world of governmental policies, law, and how that business has developed. It's important to note that some services offered within international accounts may differ from mainland China. So don't expect a like-for-like service comparing if you're expecting a unified view across all accounts globally. Also within mainland China, there's a legal requirement on user identity. So any administrator within mainland China must upload personal data such as the government issued ID. So if anyone's watched the movie The Matrix, so that's a movie about people live and exist in a world that's simulated, and the vast majority of people don't know it's a simulation, except for the few that see some of the cracks and realize the world's not as it seems. And it's kind of a little bit like that sometimes in cloud world. And as a security practitioner, no CSP should ever be fully trusted. You can choose to do that, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. But at the same time, I'm not saying scrutinize every detail of cloud environments either, because that's just not practical. And I'll admit as well, it's easy to fall into the illusion that everything's working perfectly each and every day, especially if you've got no errors, no pop-ups or warnings. And plus, every CSP has every security certification that's possible to achieve to give that assurance. So this is not derogatory and definitely not isolated to AliCloud. AWS, Azure, and GCP have all had their issues and will no doubt continue to do so. But it is good to call out any issues we find. I think there's one big positive with CSP, being that they are competitive and they will need to be responsive to issues as we find them. So some of the things that I've observed with AliCloud, so I've had experiences of services becoming unavailable where they just stop working. Services disappear without warning if it's relatively new. Links to documentation may change. I found as well that things like the root password is limited to 20 characters as a maximum, compared to other cloud providers where the characters exceed 100. So it's a significant difference there. And then you got features such as user credential report that doesn't complete when requested. And I think a lot of this activity is just really down to the agile development nature of how AliCloud operate. Lots of changes and often. So it's not waiting for the perfect product, but it's about getting a viable product out that's usable, but may lack some of the features. And I think if this is correct, this is the best approach in today's world. So documentation, one of the first things I will ask with all security, well, most security requests is show me the documentation. Generally speaking, quality documentation reflects a quality product and a good team behind it to allow that to happen. And one of my first areas, I think one of the first areas that security will look is the document section. I've noted that AliCloud documentation is improving at a really good pace. My very first experience using AliCloud a few years ago, there was more Chinese documentation in English, but there is a real notable increase in English language now as, certainly as the company opens up to more international markets. There will be some situations where you may need to use a trusted translation tool, particularly where the service may be very new or beta and you lack the language skills. Sometimes new services may not be documented, or that documentation might be difficult to find. So just like other CSP, AliCloud contains a whole host of security services to support and enable the customer and allow them to secure their accounts and environments. I don't have the time in the webcast to go through all of them. There's just so many. So I've just picked a random selection. So when you first sign into AliCloud, you'll come across a number of services all organized into various categories. And AliCloud has thankfully created a kind of a unified area called Security Center. And this consolidates all of those security services. And here you're presented with an overall score. And in my screenshot here, I've got a score of 100, which means I'm doing a fantastic job. But I am slightly cheating because I've got no assets either, if you look closely. On the left, you've got the various security services. Some are free, some will incur costs to turn on. If it's your first review of an AliCloud environment, then this is a great area to ascertain what's turned on. As I mentioned earlier, one of my concerns are organizations not allocating security resource. So in that scenario, you're likely to find nothing turned on by default, which means no detection or prevention controls in place in your organization. RAM is the resource access management. It's arguably the single most important area within AliCloud as it consolidates all the users, the roles, policies, and permissions. Besides the core functionality of IAM services, there's a couple of useful security features. The first is Security Check, which is the first, and this provides a step-by-step wizard to help you secure accounts. It's similar to the AWS account security checklist. So it recommends things like turning on the MFA on root accounts, creating accounts for daily work, enabling MFA for RAM users. There's also a second useful feature, it's a new feature called User Credential Report. So this report's supposed to provide a summary of password strength, access key pairs, MFA devices for compliance purposes. So I couldn't get that feature to work. So when I clicked the option, it gave a progress bar, and I just had to cancel it after a couple of hours. The documentation shows that there is a download later option as well. The test account that I had a couple of accounts, so it wasn't overly complex, so it's not really clear why the report didn't download immediately. But the immediate benefits of this security service is if security haven't assessed your AliCloud within your environment, then you very likely need to recommend completing the security check, as that's something that's overlooked. Not just in AliCloud, but it's similar to thing in AWS as well. And that checklist will need to be completed as a minimum baseline. And then secondly, the user credential report that I mentioned, periodically check the generated report by the security team for your compliance purposes. AliCloud also provide a WAF, a web application firewall. It's not enabled by default, but it does incur costs. It's not free of charge. WAF provides detective, filtering, preventative controls for web traffic. So it assists with mitigating web-based threats aligned to, say, example or WASP. Typically, a WAF in AliCloud environments will not be enabled by employees unless there's some level of approval. Your organization should recommend enabling WAF based on business need, budget, and security requirements. And again, in line with the importance and sensitivity of the solution that you're trying to protect. As with any WAF, there's a need to feed and water. So in other words, it's a service that cannot just be turned on and left unattended. You will need employees with skills and experience to maintain and monitor. AliCloud also provide a service called leak detection, which is not enabled by default, but can be at no cost. So if you've got developers in your organization, they're creating source code, they're managing it in repositories, as an example, GitHub. So you can integrate this feature to allow your GitHub accounts to be monitored for potential data loss. So if you've got developers producing code in AliCloud, the developer may accidentally include access keys that might get published to the internet. So if you do have that instance, if sensitive information is identified using this, an alert is generated and you can act on that. So you should recommend enabling this leak detection service where you have environments where there are developers working in-house and where you have any source code repositories as well. Anti-DDoS is denial of service protection provided by AliCloud. Basic is limited and free. It's enabled to all accounts. DDoS provides detective filtering and prevention for network traffic and helps to mitigate against denial of service. You've got DDoS Professional, which is available only to protection of server instances within China. And then you have the Premium, which is available to international users, and that provides protection to server instances outside of China. Both provide DNS diversion. So where you have DDoS traffic, it's diverted by the DDoS provider by making a DNS change. Anti-DDoS Origin is largely available within China. I believe you can make an application from an international source to have that turned on as well. And that is an enterprise paid for service. The comparison between professional and premium does differ, but it's not clear from those comparisons if the features have any detrimental impact or quality of service or performance. Professional and premium services are not enabled by default. They do incur costs and it's not free. Typically, DDoS in AliCloud environments will not be enabled by employees unless there's some specific approval in place. And you should recommend enabling DDoS protection again based on business need, budget, and security requirements. Alibaba do provide a very detailed comparison on their website if you need more detail on that. AliCloud also provides comprehensive collection of API libraries, so you can automate and query cloud services. So these include, but are not limited to, log analysis, config assessment, vulnerability management, asset management, just to name a few for security uses. I would say that the collection of API operations currently available is comprehensive and it's well documented. There are still a few areas that need development if they need to be up to the level of AWS or Azure. So as an example, it would be good to see something that's more compliance operations. So they could maybe support security frameworks such as the Center for Internet Security frameworks. So from an initial review of AliCloud in your enterprise, I wouldn't recommend immediately prioritizing API integration unless you've got a mature onboarding process of new API operations in place. API usage would, of course, be a recommended step up from moving from any established manual processes. I would recommend reading the security API reference as well as a place to start. There's a really long list of API operations relevant for security uses. So this is a very brief example of an API command. So a user could install the command. The user could call the command from the terminal prompt. So the user would first need to download and install the Alibaba CLI software. And then from the terminal, you would type in the command alion, and you would add the necessary parameters to what's on the screen here. And in this example here, you can use to query any image that's been alerted as containing malicious files. So what next? You've got, so there's a number of resources that I would recommend visiting. Alibaba do have a limited set of training available online, and that provides coverage of the core security services. There's also accompanying security certifications. At the time of the webcast, when I started preparing for this, AliCloud Security Expert course was under development. I think it's called the Professional, is available at the moment. So it would be a useful recommendation for any operational user of AliCloud in your enterprise, including security, to undertake the relevant training for upskill and development. The cost of the course are about 1 cent, so it's almost free. And the certifications to do the exams are around about $200. And the duration of the courses are not extensive. I think it's 1 or 2 days, so it's very manageable. Alibaba also release white papers, which never used to exist, and these provide a really great summary of services. I would recommend not only downloading and reading those, but pass them on to colleagues, just to make them aware of this provider and as a future reference as well when needed. And then finally, I would say create a free account, familiar yourself with the look, the feel, the appearance, as a time may come in the near future. If you're not already doing so, you're going to be asked to review a solution either hosted on AliCloud or an AliCloud account itself. I just think it's really useful to have that that first-hand experience. So it doesn't stop there as well with AliCloud. As I said at the start of this webcast, there's a huge amount of reusable advice and guidance on assessing cloud environments. I previously mentioned Cloud Security Alliance, An area that factors largely in my working environment currently is CIS, the Centre for Internet Security. And the CIS provide a comprehensive collection of guidance, and it's consensus based, so lots of security practitioners around the world have worked on that. And then finally, we've got SANS, who themselves, they provide an entire cloud security curriculum, and you've got both short and long duration courses, and it's a combination of red team courses, blue team courses, and something in between. So I hope that this webcast has been useful and time well spent. I think AliCloud is an exciting CSP, and it's one that you will encounter if you're not dealing with now. It's really impossible to cover everything into one webcast. Hopefully you will leave with more questions to find out more in your own enterprises. And I hope that the recommendations I've provided during this session will be useful. AliCloud is developing rapidly, but I really believe now is the chance for many security practitioners to prepare early. Normally we get parachuted in afterwards. And for those who already have AliCloud present in their enterprises, it's clear that it needs to be assessed continually, just like any other cloud service provider. Current cloud industry direction is multi-cloud, and this is where security needs to be with that multi-cloud mindset. If we focus too much on one CSP and neglect another, that is going to increase the chance of introducing some serious security risks into your business. If you have a risk team, notify them about AliCloud and its existence in your environment. They may be unaware, and without that notification, there's going to be little evidence to help drive the need for more investment to secure your AliCloud environments. If you already have processes with dealing with cloud in your enterprise, then try to look to reuse them and repurpose. So for example, the principles for deploying servers in one provider shouldn't be too significantly different from AliCloud. And then make use of existing cloud reference material. Try to avoid reinventing something that has already been created. I think this is especially true where you have limited resource. If you have very little resource and a security assessment of AliCloud is needed, I think my advice would be prioritize the security of IAM, the Identity Access Management. This is the gateway to cloud access. And its secure configuration is often overlooked, not just in AliCloud, but in other cloud providers too. And I would also say as well that engage with your legal and data protection teams. So there may be ramifications for the deployments in AliCloud that need to be understood clearly, and that might be outside of the scope of security expertise. If legal and data protection teams are unaware, then they can't help. So I think that is everything. I'd just like to thank you again for attending. Thank you for your time and attention.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We do have a question ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for Tim, please enter it into the questions window now. Our first one asks, without naming any names, what is the main motivation for an organization to choose AliCloud? Just price? Are there anything security related for the services provided that are better? Do you have any data or research on this? And without naming the other provider, I know Tim, but I can say.
Yeah, I think the only answer to that is, the only experience I've had, and I've got no hard facts for this, is there was a perceived savings on cost. But I've not seen any written evidence of that. I think the whole argument of costs in the cloud is very difficult to substantiate, to determine who is more expensive than another. So that's the only feedback I've got on why. And it could be as well that just convenience. It's just there at the time. It's been reused.
All right. Someone's asking, is Alibaba Cloud trustworthy? And once again, it's compared to another provider. So I'm not sure if you can work with that one.
Is it trustworthy? I suppose I could turn that around and say, is anything on the internet trustworthy? You've just got to get the balance right. Security is about risk, and it depends on what you are using it for. If you look at the evidence, AliCloud is already hosting some major organizations, airlines, and providers that are providing services for millions of people. And those businesses have determined that the risk is sufficient to use AliCloud, just like any other cloud provider. So it's usually business driven, from what I've seen. Thanks.
All right, thank you. The next one asks, what internal logs or application logs are available to track the use of AliCloud for forensic investigations?
So you would have to come back at a later date, because that is something that I'm working on now. Yeah, there is extensive logging, but I've not looked at that detail yet. But it is something of importance, because if we are deploying critical solutions, the absolute minimum we need on there, we need to be able to detect badness. And if we're not doing that, then as security professionals, we're not doing our job. But it's a very good question.
All right, thank you. Does Alibaba Cloud support, and in quotes, bring your own key?
I do not know, but I can find that out.
All right, well, that's all we have submitted. Thank you so much, Tim, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.